You're good.
Alright, so thank you for coming to my action research presentation on the effects of small group and pair collaboration on writing task performance in the L2 classroom. So all this started with the identification of a problem in my classroom. Whenever I would give my students writing assignments in my classroom, I would hear a lot of complaints and things like, how long does it have to be? How many sentences do we have to write to get an A? And I noticed that students were more concerned with a grade than showing me what they knew how to do in the target language of Spanish. And that they were kind of missing the point on that. Along with that, students didn't seem to enjoy their writing, and it seemed like they were confused on how to do well with questions like, how much do I have to write, and things like that. I felt like they were missing that point. Along with that, students seemed to be stagnant in their writing abilities. Like students who would start off as really strong writers in my classroom would kind of tend to do the same kind of quality work throughout the school year. And then students who would start off writing with low quality work on writing assignments in the classroom didn't seem to be growing. And so I had various levels within any class of students with different writing skills, and then also this problem of them not seeming to enjoy the work or know exactly what they were doing with it. So that led me to these two research questions. I wanted to know, what are the effects of small group and pair collaboration on writing task performance? So I thought with this question that I could kind of clarify some of the missing pieces for my students, like how much do I have to write, how many sentences here, by going with a more task-based approach, which I'll introduce in the literature review. And then I also, with the various performance levels, I wondered what would happen if I put students at different levels together, if they would be able to help each other. So I was wanting to look at the effects of that. And then I also was interested in knowing, with trying these two new things of incorporating tasks and collaboration, I was interested in knowing what students' perceptions of working in small groups and pairs on writing tasks was. So that brings me to the importance of the study. This study was effective in helping giving me insight into a problem in my own classroom, and it will add to current SLA research about collaborative writing, especially the benefits of writing in pairs and groups and the difference there. And also it can help to inform other teachers, especially language teachers, about the benefits of collaborative writing and task-based language teaching. So, with that said, I started to look at literature, especially about task-based instruction at first, to kind of set a foundation for why I was using tasks. So task-based instruction involves learners in completing activities that are goal-oriented, meaning-centered, and designed to facilitate students' interaction with the target language, according to Rodriguez-Bonces and Rodriguez-Bonces 2010. In addition, the exercises that students complete within this model allow them to participate in genuine communication, which promotes their learning, which is what Cordova-Zuniga found in 2016. And writing tasks specifically result in deep linguistic and problem-solving processes that solidify student knowledge and learning, according to Vasilets, Gilbert, and Manchon 2017. So with that basis for task-based language teaching, I started to look at the literature on collaborative writing. And I found that learning is not just about knowledge delivery, rather it's a cognitive process of knowledge building that relies heavily on social factors. And that was according to Portnoy-Niemann and Barak, 2013. And collaborative writing, or the joint production of one text from start to finish, which is what my students participated in, leads to what is known as languaging, which is the dialogue that emerges when learners try to solve language-related problems together. And that came from Swain, 2010, as cited in Storch, 2011. The conversation that learners participate in when attempting to solve those language problems that I referred to those are known as language-related episodes, or they can also be referred to as LREs, and that comes from Storch 2011. The negotiation of meaning while working on a collaborative writing task helps learners to overcome weaknesses in their own writing by drawing on each other's strengths, so they fill in each other's gaps, and that's what Ty found in 2015. In one study that helped me to build my study, it was found that it is good for language learners to work on collaborative writing tasks because through completing the task, they solved language-related problems together. And that was according to Garcia, Mayo, and Zeitler in 2016. And they studied the difference between small group and pair collaboration. And with all that said, I also mentioned in one of my questions that I was concerned with knowing what students thought about all of this. And so I looked at the literature that talks about why student perceptions are important to our teaching, and then I also looked at some specific studies that dealt with perceptions and collaborative writing. So student perceptions let us know why learners believe they succeed or fail in certain situations, according to Yilmaz and Kayalar in 2017. And in one study that actually had to do with student perceptions and collaborative writing, most students had a positive attitude about collaborative writing and felt their writing was better because they worked together. And that was according to Jalili and Sharoki in 2017. Some challenges to group work are different members' proficiency levels with the target language and their personalities, of course. And anytime you're collaborating with anyone else, personality plays an effect in that. And that was according to Ajmi and Ali, 2014. So all of that said, the literature brought me to forming my own study, and I'll walk you through some of the methodology. First, my context. I taught at a school called Lakes Community High School in the northwest suburbs of Chicago. We serve approximately 1,400 students. 14.5% of those students are low income and receive free or reduced lunch. The makeup of the student body is, as you can tell, it's not super diverse. About 79.7% of the students are white, and then the biggest group after that are Hispanic or Latino at 11.4%, and then the other two or more races, Pacific Islander, American Indian, Asian, and Black students, we had less than 4% for each of those groups. And the students who participated in the study generally reflected the makeup of the whole student body. The participants in this study, I had 84 students give consent and assent to participate in the study, and they were all students that were enrolled in a Spanish 2 class taught by me. The control group consisted of 26 students in my first hour class. The experimental pairs were 16 students in my 7th hour class, and the experimental groups of 3 or 4 students who collaborated at the same time was made up of 42 students coming from both my 5th hour class and my 8th hour class, and those were assigned randomly. My study design, to walk you through that a little bit, the 2 arrows are the bookends of the study, and they were the individual pre-test and the individual post-test. So in measuring the effects of my experiment, I first had every student write individually on a pre-test, and then every student write individually on a post-test to see if they gained any knowledge that lasted over time. The first writing intervention, where some students collaborated and some students wrote back. So the control group wrote individually for all of these as well. The experimental pairs wrote in groups of 2 partners for all of these, and then the experimental groups of 3 and 4 wrote in either groups of 3 or 4 for all 3 of these writing task interventions. When they would do the writing task interventions, I would randomly assign groups, as I didn't want to add any other factors into their growth. I just had any students working together to see if collaboration in general led to what effects it had. Immediately following doing their writing in their groups or pairs or individually, or no, not individually, only following the people who collaborated, they would do the perceptions questionnaire via Google Forms, where they answered 4 Likert scale items having to do with what they thought about working in groups or pairs. And then the questionnaire also had 1 open-ended question that they had to answer about how useful they thought it was to work in a group and why, because I really wanted to get at some of their thoughts to get that qualitative data as well. Another qualitative piece of my experiment was that I kept an observation journal, during each of the interventions. So students would come to class, they would get their group, they would get their writing assignment, their task, and then they would get to work. And in the classes where there was collaboration, as a participant observer, I would circulate the room and write down any notes, any observations. And this also ended up looking like me transcribing live as best as I could what they were saying, what conversations they were having while they were working together. So that is all the data and the study design. To analyze the data that I was getting, the pre-tests and post-tests were both graded using our department rubric. And then I cataloged the scores into Microsoft Excel and analyzed for growth through descriptive statistics, paired and unpaired t-tests, and I also ran an effect size test. For each intervention in between the pre-test and the post-test, I cataloged the scores into a Microsoft Excel sheet as well. And I ran descriptive statistics on the main scores and also the subcategories to see if there were any trends and what the mean scores were for overall, and then also the subcategories for each group. For the questionnaire, how I analyzed that was I took the Likert scale items for the experimental pairs and groups and pulled them together for each intervention. I took the frequency of each answer. So like if a student answered 5, strongly agree, or say 26 students answered that, then the number I came up with was 26. So I took the frequency of those answers to see how many students were responding each way to the Likert scale items. The answers to the open-ended questions, I looked at them and I used inductive coding to analyze them for trends and patterns. And what I came up with for my 3 categories was that students either had a positive response to collaboration because it had to do with their learning, like sharing ideas, things like that. Or another category that was also positive was that students enjoyed collaborating because it was like a buffer in case they forgot something or like they were relieved that a partner remembered a word that they didn't. And then negative because I had so few negative responses to the open-ended question. If it was negative for any reason, it went in the same category. And then to analyze my own teacher observation journal, I also used inductive coding, and what that led me to was that most of my entries were found to contain language-related episodes that I heard the students having, either related to vocabulary or grammar, and then also planning conversations because they were writing together the whole product from start to finish. A lot of their talking had to do with like planning, like, well, maybe we should put this here, or like, wouldn't that sound better in the conclusion, things like that. So that brings us to my findings. What was I able to find out to answer my questions? So on the pre-test scores, you can see here that the control group scored 80.5%, the pair scored 80%, and the group scored 80.2%, which is all super close, which was encouraging to find that, that all of them scored similarly. I felt like that meant that my students were all starting on even playing field going into the experiment with those pre-test scores. The post-test scores, you can see the control group scored 82.4% on the post-test, the pairs 81.3%, and the groups 86%. So everyone experienced some growth between the pre-test and post-test, but the groups experienced the most growth. To look at that statistically with the t-test, what I found was that the control group, the p-value that I got for that t-test was 0.323, which was not statistically significant between pre-test and post-test. The pairs, the p-value was 0.506, also not statistically significant. And the groups had a p-value of less than 0.000004, which was statistically significant growth between the pre-test and post-test. So I didn't stop there. I wanted to look at the post-to-post comparison. So I compared the control group to both of my experimental groups, and I wasn't able to find statistical significance between the difference in their post-test scores. For the control versus pairs, I found a p-value of less than 0.780, and the control versus groups, the p-value was equal to 0.148. When I ran an effect size test, because my sample sizes were all really different than each other, the control versus pairs led to a g-value equal to 0.1, which indicated that there was no effect. And then the control versus groups, the g-value was greater than 0.2, which indicated that the experiment had a small effect. So the actual interventions, the quantitative data with that, you can see up here that the pink is the control group, the purple is pairs, and the blue is the experimental groups. You can see that collaboration led to higher scores consistently, and then especially collaboration in groups. And you can also see that the second intervention was possibly like harder content for the students, could explain the lower score between the first intervention and the second intervention. For the Likert scale items, the first Likert scale item read, all members contributed to the completion of the writing task, and so students could either strongly disagree all the way up to strongly agree with that statement. And so I was concerned with like maybe one person was doing all the work or one person was slacking off, but you can see here that most students strongly agreed with that statement. Those who didn't strongly agree, most of the rest of the students agreed. A few were unsure, maybe 2 disagreed and 1 strongly disagreed. And then this is coded also for the interventions. The pink is the first intervention that we did, the purple is the second intervention, and the blue is the third. Likert scale, item number 2, I learned more Spanish from working with a group or partner. You can see the similar trend here. Most students strongly agreed, some were unsure, some disagreed, and very few strongly disagreed. Likert item number 3, our task was better than if I would have had to write on my own. Again, same thing here. Most students strongly agreeing with that statement, some agreeing, a few unsure, a few disagreeing, and on this one, no one strongly disagreed with that statement. For Likert item number 4, the last one, I like working with a partner or a group. Almost everyone strongly agreed again. Same trend here. Some strongly agreeing, or most strongly agreeing, some unsure. On the first intervention, 3 students disagreed with that, but then after that, no one disagreed with the statement. Also on the questionnaire was the open-ended question. How useful do you think it is to work in a group and why? And so students who had a positive response because it led to more ideas, sharing, contributing, and learning. There were 43 responses like that, and this is just for writing task number 2. And some of the responses said things like, it is very useful because we can bounce ideas back and forth and get the best result for the best grade. Other students said, I think it's very useful to work in a group. When you're in a group, you combine the minds of you and your group members to create the best work possible. Other students who said it was a positive experience because it's a buffer in case you or someone else in your group forgot something. There were 15 responses like that for writing task number 2. And they said things like, it's good because they can remind you of a word that you might not remember from the unit. Or I think it's extremely helpful because it's stressful when you can't remember some words, and it's relieving to have others in the same class give you ideas. And then for negative of any reason for writing task number 2, I got 3 negative responses. Here are 2 of those 3 responses. I think it's helpful, but depending on your partner, it can be more or less helpful. And then it is helpful because I learned how to spell things, but I didn't like when they changed what we wrote without telling me, so some group tension there. In my teacher observation journal, I mentioned that there were LREs that were in there of things that I was taking note of while the students were saying them. This example that I have is related to grammar, and it says, student 1 said, we could say porque or para nadar. Porque me gusta nadar. Student 2, yeah, isn't it when you put porque you have to conjugate? Yeah, but you won't conjugate because it's I like to swim. Is it unos goggles or los goggles? It could be either because it's some goggles or the goggles. we could put mis scobles. So these are the kinds of students, or the kinds of conversations that students were having when they're making decisions in their groups. So to discuss some of my findings, what I found was that students who worked in collaborative groups of 3 or 4 grew the most of any of the groups from pre-test to post-test, and that was statistically significant growth. But when their post-tests were compared to each other, the results were not statistically significant. And also the effect test only indicated a small effect that the experiment had. On the actual interventions themselves, collaboration consistently led to higher scores, especially in groups, but also in pairs. And students enjoyed the interventions and thought they were leading to language learning and better writing. So I was really happy with all of those results. And especially, I thought that the qualitative information was very rich. The study did not come without its own limitations, though. Some of the limitations to the study were the number and frequency of interventions. As you saw in my study design, the interventions, like between the pre-test and the first intervention, there was a significant amount of time, and then between the first intervention and the second intervention, there was also a significant amount of time, but then after that, there was only about a week before the third intervention and then another week before the post-test. So that was a significant limitation to the study. The tests themselves did not require the same level of proficiency for each one. Like the pre-test was significantly easier than the post-test as far as the language level required to complete the task. And the results are limited to my specific school context and my students. So maybe even the results aren't even applicable to another Spanish 2 class in the same building. It was just unique to my classes. And the introduction of tasks and collaboration at the same time makes it hard to differentiate between what might have caused the improvement that I saw. Was it the test or was it the collaboration? So some recommendations I have for people looking to do something similar in the future. I recommend incorporating tasks and collaboration into your classroom. If you're considering doing it, I say go for it. I ended up liking it so much that I used it all throughout second semester as well. And I would even have students ask sometime, like, when are we writing in groups again? And so I was really excited that they enjoyed it and that it just became a normal part of our routine to collaborate. I would recommend more consistent interventions over a longer period of time. I was limited to what I was able to do with my curriculum and with my schedule for writing my paper, but I recommend in the future maybe doing something like that. And I recommend deciding what interventions that you're going to do ahead of time and scaling them to be more similar in the skills required. It wasn't until later on that I found that I wasn't going to be able to test them on similar skills just because of the units and the things that they had to talk about. So these are my references. Do you have any questions? Yeah.
Your pair groups, those were mixed ones, right, where there was a high achiever and a lower achiever on purpose?
No, that would have been another interesting thing to do, was to put the groups together on purpose, but because I think my original thinking going into that was that I wanted it to be collaboration, like being the only thing studied. And so the pairs were random, and so sometimes it'd be like 2 low students together, 2 really high students together, a low student and a high student. And yeah, I didn't really control for that. Yeah.
Kind of in the same vein, so if you want to put a random pairing where you had a higher achieving student and a lower achieving student, how did you prevent the higher achieving student from just doing the whole thing and then the lower achieving student not?
So, that didn't actually happen very often, but in the times when it did happen, I didn't do anything. I was a participant observer, but the only thing I did as a participant observer was circulate the room, and it seemed like my presence kind of, like I never saw like one person working and one person goofing off. So, so I don't know if that answers the question, but I think that that helped. And then it was cool because some students, like I found, and this was consistent with the literature too, that even the lower achieving students had something to offer, and especially in the groups, like maybe they wouldn't be like formatting the sentences or things like that, but they would be interjecting with like suggestions or vocabulary and what they could. So, yeah. Any other questions?